Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. Former Vice President Joe Biden, the projected winner of the November 3rd election, convened his own meetings with diplomatic, intelligence, and defense experts. While Biden continues on with his transition plans, the U.S. Department of the Treasury slapped sanctions on 2 more companies for their alleged involvement in business with North Korea. Today, we'll discuss what kind of challenges the Biden administration will face in the Indo-Pacific region, including the Korean Peninsula. Joining us is Elbridge Colby, co-founder and the principal of the Marathon Initiative. He previously served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's Director of the program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Young.
First of all, let's start with President Donald Trump's order to remove about 2,000 troops from Afghanistan and 500 troops from Iraq before next year's U.S. presidential inauguration. What is the meaning of this move? Mr. Colby, can we start with you?
Sure. Well, thanks, Young-go. Thanks, Liz, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with Scott. I think this is a fulfillment of a long-time campaign pledge and political pledge that the president has made. But more deeply, I think there is a growing consensus across a broad, maybe not a consensus, but a growing sense across a broad spectrum of certainly the political environment in the United States, as well as the national security community, that we do really need to reduce and potentially extricate from these sort of endless wars in the politically fraught terminology. So yeah, I'm generally supportive of moves to bring down our force presence in both those areas to focus on Asia, and particularly China and Asia.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, will this have any implications for the U.S. troops in South Korea?
I'm not expecting that the Trump administration in its waning days will announce for any troop reductions from South Korea. For one, I think that there's just not time to do that. The orders related to Afghanistan are going to be completed within days of the inauguration. And so I think that it's likely that the U.S. force presence in Korea will remain stable through into the next administration.
President Trump repeatedly asked the allies to equally share the defense cost, which has put some strain on the alliances, including that of the U.S. and South Korea. Mr. Colby, how should the Biden administration deal with this issue?
Well, I think this is actually going to be an area of real difficulty for a Biden administration. I mean, I think Vice President Biden ran on a platform of sort of, we're back, America, we're going to work with allies and so forth. But President Trump, I think, has really put his finger in a sort of a pointed and direct way on an issue that had been intensifying for some time. I mean, people point out that President Obama made this point in his famous Atlantic interview. Secretary Gates and others had really started to put much more pressure on allies, particularly in Europe in that case, to contribute more. So there is a fundamental structural need. And stepping back, the United States does need its allies and partners to do more. I think South Korea, in a way, might be in a better position because if you look at the level of defense effort by the Republic of Korea, it's actually quite high relative to other U.S. allies, both in Asia and in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what about you? What is the appropriate level for burden sharing?
Well, I think that the main point really is that the U.S. framing of this issue is going to shift from one that is focused specifically on transactionalism and on money to questions related to efficiency and commitment. And I actually think that's a better way to approach the issue, especially with a longstanding ally like South Korea. And I think that it's true that there will be expectations, higher expectations, for South Korea to meet under a Biden administration in many of these in this area. And there also is a lot of underbrush in terms of issues that had not been dealt with in the Trump administration because of the focus on money that are going to have to be dealt with now. Issues related to adequate training, especially air training, and issues related to logistic support for the THAAD missile system are both issues that have not gotten as much attention because of the focus on the burden sharing, the monetary aspects of burden sharing. And then Bridge is right, stepping back, that one of the challenges for the alliance more broadly is how does South Korea respond to the need to broaden the aperture of the alliance to focus not only on North Korea, but also on regional policies in East Asia.
Mm-hmm. And the U.S. and South Korean governments have been discussing the transition of the wartime operational control of the South Korean troops from the United States to South Korea. South Korea's Moon administration has been eager to expedite this process, but U.S. Forces Korea Commander General Robert Abrams said it is premature to speculate on when the transition will occur. What factors should the Biden administration consider when discussing this matter with South Korea? Mr. Snyder first.
Well, I really don't expect there to be much of a change in policy between the Trump and Biden administrations on this issue because it's primarily set based on previously agreed institutional requirements. And it is a process that has been agreed to be conditions-based. And so the issue really is that President Moon wants to change those conditions, or not change the conditions, but kind of fast forward the effort to meet the conditions in order to meet a particular time deadline. And I think that could be a source of tension between Moon and Biden, and I expect that it will probably have to be resolved in discussions at the top level. And I think that it probably can be resolved, but if I were on advising President-elect Biden, I would suggest that if he decides to do a political favor for Moon, that he ought to get a political favor in return.
Mr. Colby, would you like to add to this?
Sure. Well, I think Scott laid out the framework and the assessment very well, so I wouldn't comment on that. I would just say that, I'm more sympathetic to a transfer of operational control than some Americans. I think the frame and where the Trump administration to some extent had an important point was that the posture on the peninsula is an archaic posture. It's largely oriented towards the conventional defense of South Korea, but I think as the Pentagon and others have made clear, the U.S. focus really has to be on the defense of its allies, and I think Taiwan from a Chinese assault, and that's only becoming more and more severe. So anything around the world that's not sort of oriented towards that or efficiently allocated in a kind of cost-effective way to secondary missions, I think is going to have to be on the chopping block at some point or another. Now, of course, there's a different potential posture on the peninsula that could be more, mobile, of course. And these issues have come up in the past between the United States and South Korea. So I don't think I'm not saying that the United States should pull all of its forces off the peninsula, but I do think we need to take a hard look over the coming years at what the posture is and what it's supposed to be doing. I think my view is that the Republic of Korea should really essentially be responsible for the defense of the South against a northern conventional attack. Obviously, the United States can assist in that respect and deal with the nuclear threat in particular, along with South Korean efforts at missile defenses and others.
And during the past few years, the U.S. and South Korea have significantly reduced joint military exercises. It was largely due to President Trump's engagement with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, but also the pandemic played its part too. Should the U.S. and South Korea ramp up the level of the military exercises between the two countries? Mr. Colby?
Well, as I said earlier, I think everything the United States military should be doing is primarily about preparing for a conflict with China in order to deter it. So, and any other activities should be done in a cost-effective and efficient way for secondary missions. And of course, the exercises on the peninsula are about North Korea. So I don't think we should increase the exercises for its own sake. If there are particular gaps that need to be addressed or benefits that come out of it, I think that's all to the good, and I think I'm sure there could be a resumption of a higher tempo of exercise without too much of a dent on U.S. funds and efforts.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what is your view on this joint military exercise?
Well, I think it's going to have to be looked at and discussed, and I think that it will be looked at through the lens of, in particular, how North Korea might respond. But it really, primarily from a commander's perspective, has to be looked at through the lens of readiness. But I also just want to say that what Bridge is talking about is very resonant, I think, with some of the primary emphasis of people close to the Biden campaign. I think that the challenge of finding ways to enhance the credibility of extended deterrence, both vis-a-vis China and North Korea, is going to be one of the challenges that the Moon administration is going to find itself having to respond to in a Biden administration.
By the way, how will North Korea react after Biden administration comes in? Do you expect any provocations from North Korea, Mr. Snyder?
Well, a lot of analysts believe that provocations are in North Korea's DNA. But I'm actually more worried about stalemate on the negotiation front than I am about provocations. My own view is actually, I think that some, as they think about how to prepare for a possible provocation by North Korea, who are on the Democratic side, would actually welcome a provocation as a means by which to try to bring China back on side in terms of enhancing pressure on North Korea. And I also think that there's a lot that North Korea would lose in terms of its own interest if they pursue a provocation. Most notably, the North Koreans always want to approach the rest of the world from a position of strength. But an early provocation, in my view, reveals weakness because it reveals a lack of confidence in the nuclear deterrent that they've been so focused on trying to develop.
Top U.S. General Mark Milley had a video conference with his counterparts in South Korea and Japan, agreeing to cooperate for peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Why are the relations between South Korea and Japan so important for the United States? Mr. Colby?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, again, we are in the United States are increasingly and primarily focused on China, and we can't afford to have deep fissures among our allies, and particularly between our two most capable and largest allies in the region, Japan and South Korea. And I would underscore Scott's point, I think, about people around the Biden world also having this kind of perception on China. I don't want to put words in Scott's mouth, but I think former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work was speaking at the Center for a New American Security, my old home, yesterday, I believe, and he pointed out that he thinks that the outlines of the 2018 National Defense Strategy will be largely carried forward. And in fact, the debate will be just how much to focus on China rather than whether. And then I think Russia being the other primary factor. One voice, but he did brief Vice President Biden the other day, so certainly an influential one. So I think this is going to obviously be the kind of the setting, and of course it also has relevance in the North Korea context as well. I certainly think it's critical, it's important. We are going to need to move away from the traditional hub and spoke model to some extent. I'm probably a little bit more sanguine about the need for Japanese South Korean cooperation than some, although I do think it's near and dear to the heart of many around Biden world. But I think, moving in the right direction and certainly avoiding sort of a fracas between the two allies is going to be important.
Indeed, there are some efforts between South Korea and Japan aiming at improving cooperation between the two countries. This kind of atmosphere is quite different from the beginning of the year. Why a sudden change in the mood, do you think, Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think that both administrations have begun to anticipate that the Biden administration is going to restore an emphasis on trilateral cooperation and on coordination between alliances. And so in some ways, it's the first early sign of a benefit that accompanies a return to a more conventional approach in Asia for the United States.
Mr. Snyder, I would like to touch upon the relations between Japan and North Korea here. North Korea remains silent, even though Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga declared his willingness to meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un without preconditions. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, I think the North Koreans' outreach toward Japan has been subordinate to progress in the U.S.-North Korea relationship and the inter-Korean relationship, and there's nothing there. But also, I think that the abduction issue in particular has been handled in such a way that there's a bad taste on both sides between Japan and North Korea, and so it means that it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to find a way to move forward in that relationship.
There are reports from South Korea that Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi may visit South Korea later this month, around the time of his prospective visit to Japan. The U.S. State Department has been making clear that China is put at the top of the priority list for the U.S. diplomats. Mr. Colby, how do you expect Biden will deal with China, and what kind of the implications will it have for the U.S. policy towards South and North Korea?
Well, as I said earlier, I think South Korea could find itself in a bit of a bind here. I think under President Trump, obviously there's been a very kind of blunt and forthright shift on China. It enjoys bipartisan support in a lot of ways, although the depth and breadth of that is still to be determined as we go forward. But I think one of the things about the Trump administration is that it's willingness to do things on its own. The United States doing things on its own. While it may have alienated allies in other countries in certain ways, in other ways, I think was actually quite convenient for countries that didn't want to take on China directly. And this is, of course, very common in Asia. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why the Trump administration is considerably maybe more popular, or at least less unpopular in a lot of parts of Asia, certainly Asian governments, than it is, say, in Europe, where there's widespread. I think it's indisputable to say that it's not popular among large fractions of European governments. But I think in Asia that's less true. Maybe not the style, but the substance of it. And I think you've seen this in reporting recently, that countries like Taiwan, of course, Japan, even Vietnam, even Australia, India, et cetera. While I think they're would welcome working with an American government of either political party, there is concern that there will be less of a willingness. And I think some of the articles about Susan Rice's potential nomination have caused real concern, I think, in Asia. And I think why this is relevant for South Korea is, of course, particularly under the Moon government, it seems that South Korea does not want to, take on or alienate China directly. But I think, Biden did run on a, I'm going to compete with China policy course. He says he's going to do it differently and maybe a little bit in more of a mild way than President Trump has. But basically, the content will remain the same, but it will rely much more on engagement with allies. Well, when push comes to shove on that point, that means that the Biden administration is going to come to places like Seoul and say, what are you willing to do with us vis-a-vis China? That's when we really come down to the nub.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Department of the Treasury most recently slapped sanctions on 2 companies operating out of Russia for their alleged involvement in the exploitation of forced labor from North Korea. Mr. Snyder, what does this tell us?
Well, I see the Treasury's announcement as a sanctions enforcement measure. It's aimed at enforcing the UN Security Council sanctions on the books related to North Korean labor exports. And it really is, I think, focused on sending a signal to Russia that it wants to see compliance with and enforcement of the Security Council resolutions, because, as we all know, Russia, along with China, has really not been doing its job on the enforcement front.
The Third Committee of the UN General Assembly adopted a North Korean human rights resolution for the 16th consecutive year, and the resolution is expected to be put to the General Assembly next month. And it shows that the reality, North Korea continues to sacrifice more of its own people in pursuit of missiles and nuclear weapons. Mr. Colby and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.